When Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier was announced as a themed mobile-exclusive battle royale experience, it certainly raised a few eyebrows. There were question marks as to whether it was the kind of experience existing fans of the franchise were wanting or expecting, and whether it made sense for the venerable Final Fantasy franchise to be peddled out in such a manner. Less than 12 months on, we now have our answer, as Square Enix has issued a statement notifying those still playing the game that it will be terminated on the 11th of January 2023. And based on this, it doesn't feel too damning to say that this ill-informed and largely unwanted experiment can only be seen as a failure. Square Enix had hinted that they will be producing numerous spin-off titles relating to the Final Fantasy VII Remake over 5 years ago. But when they did so, games like The First Soldier were probably not what anyone expected. The initial hint came via an interview Famitsu conducted with Yoshinori Kitase in conjunction with the Final Fantasy 30th Anniversary opening ceremony. Famitsu used their initial questions to probe Kitase around the game being released in multiple parts, a similar approach to everyone else, but instead of focusing on the obvious angle of how this approach would affect story delivery, they took a different tact. It meant their initial questions were more about the timescale between releases and the struggles that Square Enix would no doubt face as a result. This saw them focus on wanting to understand how Square Enix would be able to tackle the challenge of maintaining the quality of the Final Fantasy VII Remake project. There was a belief that with the project being planned to span many years, as well as different console generations, this would be difficult. And after Kitase responded, essentially saying they would do the best that they could, Famitsu then had a follow-up question about how Square Enix expected to keep players engaged as they waited for subsequent parts to be delivered. In response, Kitase said, "Final Fantasy VII spreads out laterally in a compilation. There isn't a concrete plan at the moment, but since we can't put out a new game in just a few months, I want to think of a way to sustain interest in between releases." Famitsu then probed further, asking if this meant they would be doing broadcasts similar to the Active Time Report or Letter from the Producer Live, or whether they would be releasing downloadable content or supporting smartphone products, much like I've been seeing with Final Fantasy XV. To this, Kitase replied, "Yes, I would like to use Final Fantasy XV as a point of reference. But while it would be nice to be able to take measures such as doing live streams to interact with users, with this multi-release system, I think we're going to be using all of our energy on reaching the end of the original game, so I don't really know whether or not we'll be able to do things like that in between the parts or outside of the other titles we're planning to produce." Fast forward a few years, and we can see that even though Kitase's plan wasn't concrete, it played out much as he had anticipated. Over the years, there have seldom been updates relating to the Final Fantasy VII Remake. Most of the time, they have been quite sporadic or aligned with other events that were taking place. They also worked on some downloadable content in the form of episode Intermission, which introduced Yuffie Kisaragi, and released Intergrade, an enhanced version of the game that took advantage of the expanded specifications offered up by PCs and the PlayStation 5. And lastly, they not only shared plans around those other titles they were planning to produce, but they released a few of them already, such as the Final Fantasy VII Remake Traces of Two Pasts novel, and of course, Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier. In early 2021, Square Enix filed trademarks for two specific phrases, Ever Crisis and The First Soldier. At the time, there were rumblings that the latter name would refer to Sephiroth, with there being a strong hope that The First Soldier would be a brand new game focused around exploring Sephiroth's backstory in more detail. However, just over a month later, expectant players were given a rather rude awakening, as Final Fantasy VII The First Soldier was announced as a battle royale action game set in Midgar. The immediate response was one of bewilderment. Of all the video game genres to exist, a third-person shooter battle royale was the last one anybody expected to be fused with the venerable Final Fantasy brand. A month later, Tetsuya Nomura attempted to explain the decision via an interview with Famitsu. Within, he said, "The fan demographics for long-running IP series do tend to become quite fixed, making it something of a challenge for us to appeal outside of that existing fan group. As such, The First Soldier had not been made with existing fans in mind. Instead, they hoped the game would appeal to players of games like Fortnite, PUBG, and Call of Duty Warzone, and make them intrigued about the world of Final Fantasy VII to the point that they would then want to continue exploring the wider compilation." The only issue was that Nomura, the visionary behind the project, did not play battle royale games and had no real interest in them. To counter this deficiency, Square Enix assigned Shuichi Ichikawa as producer. Ichikawa had previously been assistant producer on Flame X Blaze, and although he had never been involved with the production of a battle royale game himself, he was said to be a huge fan of the genre, and Nomura hoped that this meant he could safely make reckless proposals knowing that Ichikawa would be there to keep them in check. As had been the case with many other mobile titles produced by Square Enix, they chose to outsource development to a third party. And instead of collaborating with a previous partner or one who specialized in creating battle royale experiences or even third-person shooters, they chose to award the production contract to a company called Ateam. After being founded towards the start of the year 2000, Ateam had developed numerous business divisions, with the core three being e-commerce, lifestyle, and entertainment, and through this they had ended up becoming a very successful company in the mobile space, generating around $225 million per year. Within their entertainment segment, their first game was a game called Eternal Zone. This launched in 2006 and was claimed to be the first MMORPG designed specifically for mobile phones. Deemed a success, it was followed up by games like Dark Summoner and War of Legions, which were targeted at English-speaking audiences, before Ateam tackled the Japanese market hard through games like Valkyrie Connect, Three Kingdoms Smash, and Unison League, the former of which even had a big tie-in with Street Fighter. Each game had a similar base though, with role-playing often at the core, and by 2017 they were generating approximately $100 million a year for the company, nowhere near the feats achieved by companies like Square Enix, but still strong returns nonetheless. Due to their success, they had also had the chance to experiment with games like Derby Impact, and had also collaborated to create Hatsune Miku Tap Wonder. But the one thing they had never created before was any kind of action-orientated game, and they had certainly never created a battle royale experience, later noting themselves that the First Soldier would be Japan's first ever large-scale battle royale project. Still, Square Enix were utterly convinced that Ateam were the right partner to make this vision a reality, and a few months after the announcement trailer, we got to learn more about the vision via a rather surprising source, a lengthy live stream broadcast. Kitase had been quite clear that senior figures would be too busy to produce live streams in relation to the Final Fantasy VII Remake, but for the First Soldier, it was decided that they should adopt a different approach. So, on the 7th of May 2021, Square Enix went live with what would end up being one of the first of many official live broadcasts for the game. It would see Ishikawa act as the main production representative, with Nomura present as a remote guest, and within they shared the approach they were taking to try and make the First Soldier stand out in a rather competitive and saturated marketplace. They also shared that players wouldn't have too long to wait to see how this played out in reality, as they would be launching a closed beta just a few weeks later for gamers in Japan, Canada, and the United States. Within their FY 2021 Q3 earnings report, Ateam revealed that the Japanese beta would have 20,000 participants, with them split 50-50 between iOS and Android devices. And there was a general sense of intrigue heading into that beta, as gamers were keen to find out whether the First Soldier would end up being a train wreck or would be a strong entry into the battle royale genre. 2 months later, those who weren't able to take part in the beta themselves were given some data to help answer that question, as Square Enix shared the results of a survey they sent out to beta participants. Top-line stat was that 93% of participants were either satisfied or very satisfied with the experience, and that 90% of participants felt the game either delivered on their expectations or had exceeded them. It was incredibly positive, but that's not to say there weren't some issues. Only 30% said the controls felt natural and intuitive, and when it came to suggestions for where the First Soldier could be improved, those issues were reflected, as 60% said they wanted improvements made to either the character handling or weapon handling. Going more granular, the development team shared that prominent feedback in those areas related to a lack of controller support, sensitivity issues, there being no training mode, and there being no plans to release the game on any platform other than mobile. In response, the development team vowed to address some of these issues head-on. It saw them commit to improving the UI and adding controller support and a training mode. They would also make optimizations to help battery life consumption and phone overheating, and it was all incredibly positive. This news was then followed up by another livestream. It took place during the Tokyo Game Show, and alongside a brand new trailer, they promised to answer fan questions directly. Square Enix then announced that pre-registration would take place towards the end of October, and they would even be launching an ambassador program. It meant everything was moving in the right direction, and within days of the pre-registration going live, the results were clear. The first soldier smashed the 300,000 milestone after only a few days, and by the 16th of November, it had achieved over 2 million pre-registrations. Key influencers were also sent some pretty amazing swag to continue the momentum. Everything was gearing up for the game to have a very successful launch, and outside of some horrible server issues, the game did enjoy a very successful launch. Reviews were pretty positive, both from consumers and even professional critics, and players seemed happy. A few weeks after launch, Square Enix and Ateam also showed that they were going to be active participants in the relationship by publishing the first letter from the devs. It discussed numerous bug fixes, enhancements such as the 60 frames per second mode, and that they would be running another live stream the following month. But despite the commitment and all the positive praise in those first few weeks, the cracks began to show. It didn't take too long for there to be reports that the player base had shrunk so much that bots were making up the majority of the 100 players featured within each round. This notion was echoed by YouTubers such as Funkady and Nerd Knight, the latter of which joked that instead of being a PvP game, it would probably be more accurate to call the first soldier a PvE game. Concerning as this was, Square Enix and Ateam continued trying to support the game as best as they could. They continued to launch new seasons, refresh participants within their ambassador program, and run collaborations, one of which was with the J-rock band Man with a Mission. But even though much of this was cool and led to loads of social media engagement, it did little to actually breathe life into the game itself. And by looking at financial reports, the huge financial burden this lack of life placed on Ateam was quite clear. It could also be suggested, given how much it impacted Ateam's overall revenue as a company, that they were largely on the hook for the game's financial performance as opposed to Square Enix. As was revealed in Ateam's FY 2022 Q2 business report, their entertainment division went from being one that had been making a comfortable profit of around $1.8 million per quarter to one that first made a loss of $1.1 million in Q1, to one that then made the pretty astounding loss of $5 million in Q2. To explain the pretty dismal result, Ateam offered 3 reasons, and they all largely pointed towards the first soldier. They admitted that despite proudly declaring that the game had been downloaded over 1 million times within 2 days of its launch, initial sales figures were actually very low. To compensate, they had been required to spend big on advertising, and they were continuing to have to take measures to try and increase revenue, while also having to deal with the financial burden of maintaining the game and dealing with what they noted as requests. Within their FY 2022 Q3 business report, Ateam again lamented a further slowdown in sales seen within the first soldier, with a third quarter loss posted within the entertainment segment. And just over a month ago, as seen within their yearly FY 2022 report, even though the entertainment segment had returned to profitability, this was due to Ateam reducing costs associated with the new game they were producing, as opposed to an upturn in performance from the first soldier. The game was in fact called out in specific fashion in relation to the dire performance of their entertainment division throughout the year. They noted that the first soldier was a game that had high expectations but had greatly struggled. Ateam noted that despite significant investment from their part, the first soldier had struggled to generate or improve earnings, and that they were desperately trying to counter the decline, as they had also been seeing a downward trend in their other games, with no doubt hoping that due to the Final Fantasy brand, the first soldier had the potential to bring in the most revenue. Yet, here we are, just a month later, and Square Enix have pulled the plug on the project. It's difficult to say whether or not the first soldier would have performed better had it received a simultaneous PC and console release. After all, there are plenty of mobile exclusive competitive shooters like Frag Pro Shooter and Mech Arena that have generated significant amounts of revenue. But given that the first soldier will have its service terminated in less than 3 months, I guess we'll never know. What we do know is that even though Square Enix has produced numerous successful mobile games like Record Keeper, Brave Exvius, War of the Visions, and Opera Omnia, they've got a much longer list of massive failures, and unfortunately, the first soldier must now be added to that list. Based on a poll we published, we can also see that even though it may not be huge, the first soldier has damaged the brand. 12% said they are now less excited for Ever Crisis than they were before, but if we remove those who said they had no interest in Ever Crisis whatsoever to begin with, that then rises to 20%, not an insignificant number. We just have to hope that Ever Crisis is strong enough to stand on its own 2 feet so that it can start to repair the damage done, but that will only happen if Square Enix can start to learn from their mistakes. Either way, we're curious to know how many of you actually played the first Soldier, so let us know in the comments if you did, and if you're no longer playing, we're curious to know when it was that you actually stopped playing. Alright everyone, hopefully you enjoyed the video, and with that, this is Daryl signing out. I'd like to extend a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube members and supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, The Livestream, Gregory, and Lord of Morning, who are super special Onion Knight supporters, and of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.